Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Natalie Kramer, and I work with the National Community Action Partnership managing the Weatherization Leverage Partnership project here. And we are really funded by the Department of Energy to offer training and assistance to weatherization subgrantees as well as their associations in designing private partnerships and programs that leverage the Weatherization Assistance Program. So I'm excited to be hosting this webinar today, Protecting Utility Consumers in Today's Energy Market, and really the role of weatherization organizations like yourself. We really know that it's important to keep updated on current regulatory issues and also how to engage with those as we design and maintain leverage programs that serve low-income households, which is why I'm really pleased to have Elizabeth Marx here, the supervising attorney from the Pennsylvania Utility Law Project. And with that, I'll turn it over to Liz to get started with her presentation today.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks, Liz.
Great. All right. Hi, everyone. So as Natalie said, I'm with the Pennsylvania Utility Law Project. PULP is a specialty project within the Pennsylvania Legal Aid Network, and we are focused on exclusively making sure that low-income households can connect and maintain utility service on reasonable terms and conditions. So we provide education, training, advocacy, and of course representation before the Public Utility Commission for both groups of individuals and for individuals who may be facing termination. So we run a small utility hotline that's statewide and can help individuals facing the loss of service or issues with Pennsylvania's low-income programs, but we also push policy issues through representation of several different community organizations or large group clients before the PUC. So that's us in a nutshell. But I'm going to move on and briefly, I want to just first talk, and I know that this community in particular, those of you who work for community action agencies are really in tune with why utility service would be necessary, but I think it's helpful to start anything with a baseline of just why are we talking about this. And so, you know, the reason why you all are doing your work on weatherization and the many programs that Community Actions run is to make sure that the households who have low income or fewer resources than other moderate and higher income households is really about the health of the community. You know, health of the home, child development is often stunted when utility services are unaffordable. They can't do homework at night, can't sleep if it's too cold or too hot, added stress in the household. I have seen a number of cases where child custody has been transferred or dependency proceedings of children have been instituted because of the loss of utility services. Also, access to housing and making sure that you know, homelessness is under control. Folks, especially with vulnerabilities like victims of domestic violence, homeless populations, veterans, seniors, they all have not only an increased need to have access to affordable utility services, but they also have, oftentimes struggle the most to afford those services. So it can be a real catalyst to homelessness. You know, we see things like payday lending, for instance. You know, folks who can't afford utility services most often turn to really high-risk loans, or they stop paying their rent and then face eviction or foreclosure if they've, you know, stopped paying their mortgage, and homelessness increases. And you know, we see, and I've provided some Pennsylvania data, which is actually taken from Fisher, Sheehan, and Colton's Home Energy Affordability Gap Study, which they put out periodically. And in Pennsylvania, our poorest households face energy burdens upwards of 30% of their energy. And we see that this is pretty consistent across the nation. So it's not just Pennsylvania. These just happen to be Pennsylvania numbers. Compare that to moderate or higher income households pay typically between 3 to 5% of their income on energy costs. Now, many of you probably know that the federal HUD defines an affordable housing burden, meaning all of your housing costs, rent, and utilities shouldn't exceed 30% of your income total. But we're seeing low-income households facing 30%, paying 30% of their income on just energy costs alone. So you can see it's a pretty big problem, and provided a little bit of additional data from Pennsylvania, and I think this is consistent with a lot of the national trends, and that is that the electric prices are going up, but terminations, at least in our state, and I would, challenge you to take a look at what's happening in your state. Much of this data is publicly available. Pennsylvania, requires it be disclosed, and I believe other states have somewhat accessible data as well. But you see that terminations are rising at a rate even faster than the rate that services are going up. So it's got to be a combination both of affordability and what policies and procedures are in place to allow for disconnection of service or termination of service. I find, and I'll just briefly touch on this next chart, that shows gas terminations are also on the rise, in Pennsylvania anyway. They kind of spiked around 2005, but they've gone back down, and now they increase again. But you can see at the same time the cost is going down, and that's because Pennsylvania sits on Marcellus Shale, so we have a lot of really cheap, affordable natural gas, but somehow the prices for the utility service is actually continuing to be a problem, and more folks are being terminated. So, now that we kind of are on the same page about what this scope is, and I want to move quickly through that again because, the folks on this call, I think, are largely in tune with what's happening to low-income populations as far as the affordability of basic consumer services that are really necessary, right? So why engage then, right? There's a lot of different issues on the table that community action partnerships and weatherization service providers are tackling. But I think the reason why, not only self-interest, right? There's ways that you can increase your own programmatic funding to help provide more weatherization services, but also because the decisions that are being made at your utility commissions are really impacting low-income consumers. And, I'll use the adage that many of my colleagues have used before me, but if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that's really honestly true in these cases that are happening before commissions, utility commissions nationwide. Because nobody's there representing the interests of low-income people. Low-income people aren't intervening on their own. They have plenty of things, catching the bus to be able to go and apply for assistance can be difficult enough. They certainly don't have the resources to hire an attorney and represent them. And many times, even if there is a consumer advocate, and we're lucky enough in Pennsylvania to have a really strong partner in our consumer advocate who represents all residential customers. But unfortunately, our interests are not always aligned because low-income customers require, added supplemental assistance in order to afford energy. And the people that pay for that are usually other residential ratepayers. Some states will share that across the board with residential and commercial ratepayers, but generally, there's a line then that needs to be walked, especially for residential consumer advocates, for those states that do have a consumer advocate. And so they don't always align because more program dollars, more assistance equals higher rates for all residential customers generally. So once again, not there, you're on the menu. There's lots of different ways to kind of engage with your utility commission on these issues, and I'll talk about what kind of issues you might be able to leverage later on in the hour, but kind of just starting back with how do you get involved, and there's a number of different types of proceedings. There's, of course, adjudicatory, which are kind of quasi-judicial. There's rulemaking, which is kind of quasi-legislative, where the commission is making the rules then the policies that are going to apply both in low-income programs for termination or reconnection. All of those issues may be subject to legislative or quasi-legislative actions by the Commission to create additional rules. And then you also have kind of the executive arm of a commission, which, you know, kind of enforces or investigates what's happening in the field. So I kind of think of the commissions as like a swamp thing. They're kind of a little bit legislative, they're a little bit judicial, and they're a little bit executive, kind of have all of these powers wrapped into one. So there's a lot going on at your utility commission, and a lot of it's wrapped into very highly technical terms and technical proceedings that make it daunting to consider getting involved in any kind of deep way, but I promise you a lot of that technical talk is more smoke and mirrors than it is, you know, an inability to kind of break in. So I would encourage you to kind of take a look at the different types of proceedings that are going on. And now, all of those different types of proceedings have different levels of engagement that you could have. You could track issues, you know, just kind of seeing what's happening, and that's usually the best place to start, right, to kind of see what's going on and kind of monitor. You could provide kind of informal feedback. Now, usually there's some kind of ex parte rules if there's an ongoing proceeding, but if it's just that the Commission is you know, engaging in some informal inquiries, no reason why you can't write a letter and kind of participate informally off the record. There's also usually a lot of stakeholder meetings that are going on. The utilities are often required to hold stakeholder meetings, or perhaps you've had an advocate involved in other proceedings that have started a stakeholder process where it kind of gives you a seat at the table. So even if there aren't stakeholder meetings currently going on where they're seeking feedback from those of you working in the community, there are ways that you can force the utilities to have stakeholder meetings and give you a seat at the table. And I'll talk about how to do that in a little bit. You can submit comments, right? Either a short letter, which is sometimes more effective than a 50-page comment to something going on at the Commission, but paying attention and tracking those issues, you'd then be signaled as far as when it would be appropriate to send a brief letter to commissioners or Commission staff. You can then, of course, intervene as a party, and that usually requires having an attorney, and we'll talk about building a coalition with folks that might be able to help you do that if you don't have those resources. But as a consumer of electricity and a service provider in your areas, you are probably have standing to intervene as a party and to be represented in one of these cases to push the issues further. And then last, I'll note, and I'm gonna kind of harp on this a little, but working with a coalition, and I know many of you probably already do this, but working with a coalition of new and old partners on various issues, which we'll talk about, can really help to leverage your own resources and get much more involved at the Commission level to kind of push the issue for low-income consumers. So, of course, in any decision of how you're going to allocate your resources, there's lots of decisions involved. And I'd encourage you in any proceeding that you're thinking of getting involved in to kind of do some pre-planning to think about whether or not it's the proceeding presents a good opportunity to leverage program dollars, to change program policies and make them more effective for your populations, to streamline your administrative requirements that might be going on in weatherization programs or in your leveraged programs that are utility provided or provided privately. However your programs are structured, there's always improvements that that can be made to how they're administered or to the program rules for how low-income households can access those programs. And all of those types of nitty-gritty policy details get worked out at the state level, at the commission level. Of course, you're going to have to determine your staff time, funding, and whether or not you have the attorneys and experts, and that's where I think that coalition building can really help identify how you can do it on a limited budget. Some ideas of folks that we regularly work with in building our coalition in Pennsylvania to address various issues that come through. We oftentimes will draft comments, kind of very broad comments that other groups can sign on to. But even if you don't have somebody like PULP in your state reaching out to legal services or other organizations that might be interested in pushing on some of these policy issues. If you have a strong AARP chapter, they are often at the table in many of these spheres. They're well in tuned. Of course, seniors need access to utility services, so they're often at the table weighing in. NAACP has also gotten involved, and you know, especially in the environmental justice sphere, which touches utility services a lot. You know, there's clear evidence that communities of color are facing even higher energy burdens than other groups of low-income consumers, and they often face, because of the placement of different utilities in neighborhoods, often face increased environmental impacts as a result of where those utilities are operating their services. Disability rights groups. We regularly work with Disability Rights Pennsylvania, and you know, those communities often live in assisted housing and require a lot of added assistance, and there's a lot of issues to delve into with them. One that's not on this list here is healthcare providers, and they're becoming a much more key partner as we move forward, especially in leveraging additional dollars for weatherization. Where there's, you know, clear health concerns, health and safety concerns, getting additional carve-outs and money through utility programs that can be used to address mold issues, for instance, and other issues with that prevent you from doing weatherization services. If you get healthcare providers to weigh in on some of the comment proceedings or litigated proceedings that go on at the utility commissions, you may be able to have some added success in getting some of that expertise before the commission. You know, there's others listed here, veterans groups, housing providers are a big one. We've been partnering a lot lately with our Pennsylvania Housing Alliance, which works to expand access to affordable housing for all. So they've been a really helpful partner in driving additional multifamily weatherization programs to try and get what is generally a program for single-family homes to be accessible and well-designed to reach those harder-to-reach households. But again, it doesn't matter where you are in this, if you've been doing it for years or you're brand new to it, reaching out to your community partners and saying, hey, this issue of utility affordability affects your populations, it's affecting ours, let's kind of see how we can pool our resources. I think that you'll find success. Now, want to touch on how you fund it, right? Because I'm sitting here telling you you should do more advocacy on low-income access to utility services and boosting programming, but how do you pay for it, right? Everybody's got limited budgets. Well, if you're not doing WAP or LIHEAP leveraging or don't have a leveraging grant through your, here in Pennsylvania, it's administered through our Department of Community and Economic Development, but I recommend you look into weatherization leveraging. That is getting a little funding so that you can intervene in proceedings before the PUC to try and drive more utility-funded programming for energy efficiency and conservation efforts. I'll tell you, last year we had a very small leveraging grant under $50,000, and with that we were able to intervene in proceedings before the PUC to leverage over $1.5 million in additional funding for weatherization programs in particular. And now it was carved up between several different utilities in a number of different proceedings, but kind of overall the $1.5 million was what we reported in our last leveraging report. So the opportunity is there. I would encourage you to apply for leveraging funds, especially using what some of those numbers are. You can really show a positive return on the investment. As I said, it was a little bit of money they invested in us, and we were able to turn that around for, many, many times what the investment was back into low-income communities for increased programming. And some of the other things that we do through leveraging funds is we increase program or change program rules that require coordination. So in Pennsylvania, we have each of our regulated utilities has to run a low-income usage reduction program, and that is much like WAP, and it provides weatherization, usage reduction services, but they're not particularly well coordinated. So if a job gets deferred through LIRP, the low-income program in Pennsylvania, it doesn't necessarily get picked up by WAP to kind of fill in the gaps. So we're constantly looking and evaluating program rules within the utility programs and within the statewide rules for the weatherization program and for LIHEAP rules and how we use those deferred funds for weatherization to try and make them fit better and go further for low-income communities. Some of the other funding opportunities, there's oftentimes additional funding through state, community, or economic development funds. There are also, in some states, Pennsylvania's not lucky enough to have this, but intervener funds that are actually offered by the state utility, the Public Utility Commission, or authorized for that, and you can actually get funds to intervene in rate cases and represent low-income communities or other subsets of vulnerable communities. So I'd recommend that if you're in one of those states or you don't know if you're in one of those states, to check it out. It's something we've looked at trying to get here in Pennsylvania. It's not really the right time for us to push that, but it's always in the back of our minds that someday we'd like to have some intervener funds available here. Then, of course, collaborate with your legal services organizations. I come from a background in working in domestic violence direct services, so I'm constantly surprised at how our different kind of spheres, right? Legal services, domestic violence service coordinators, community action partnerships, many who are doing very overlapping work are not connecting. So reach out to your local legal services, see if there's a project that's kind of focused on utility services or if there's a desire to do that. Perhaps pursue coordinated funding programs. Foundations especially really like to fund things that are coordinated amongst community members. So again, harping back on that, reach out to your allied organizations because that may give you some funding opportunities. I'm going to pause and see if any questions have come through, Natalie. I don't see anything, but I just want to make sure I'm addressing anything that might have come through and encourage folks to ask questions if they haven't already.
Nope, we haven't received any questions yet, but definitely feel free to send those through the chat window so we can make sure that Liz sees those.
Great. Okay, well then I will keep on trucking through this. Again, if anyone has questions, please feel free to stop me. I'm going to turn now, and I kind of laid the groundwork for how you would do this, why you would do this. I'm going to talk now in more depth for a little while about the various opportunities and kinds of proceedings that are happening right now at state utility commissions across the nation. And the first is the creation, design, implementation, and coordination and administration of universal service and low-income programs. Not all states have universal service or low-income utility-run assistance programs yet, but most of them do at various stages of development. Typically, these programs are subject to some form of formal review before the Utility Commission. And when they're subject to formal review, that generally means you've got an opportunity to A, weigh in and say this program is, not sufficiently funded, not effectively designed, just not meeting the needs of the community. And maybe they are. Maybe they are really doing a bang-up job, and you want to weigh in there too. But usually there's room for progress, room for expanded funding, and pointing those out. The need is a real need before the utility commissions. They don't hear often enough from those who are administering programs or those who are serving the communities whether or not the resources are sufficient. So as weatherization providers and CAP agencies, it's really important that they hear your voice, not only on, the desire for you, if you have the contracts, to continue administering them, but whether or not it's meeting the need that you're seeing. Because the commissioners, their staff, the judges who are deciding this, all of those who are involved, they aren't on the ground like you are. They're not seeing person after person who can't afford to pay their bill. They're not seeing the shape and condition that low-income housing is in many areas of the nation. And that's something that they really need to hear from your community in particular. In addition to the energy efficiency and weatherization programs that I think you all are involved in some way with, leveraging additional bill payment assistance programs. And I think as a component of bill pay assistance programs, there needs to be an arrearage management program that can help people manage bad debt that they've accrued because of unaffordable bills. So, and there's constantly different aspects of that can be subject to design. Just mention briefly in Pennsylvania, some of the rules over time that we've been able to develop have been a priority and a requirement that to the extent possible, utilities contract with local community-based organizations. And that has enabled community action agencies in Pennsylvania to really many times have the contracts with utilities to administer their bill payment assistance programs and weatherization assistance programs. So it helps with coordination, helps make sure that when someone walks through the door, you're able to provide them with all of those different aspects of assistance. So that's kind of the obvious one, like get involved in the low-income programs can help leverage dollars for your program and for those in the community. The next one is base rate proceedings. Now, a base rate proceeding is how a regulated utility or an investor-owned utility would set their rates, and they must be just and reasonable. We believe, and many share this belief, though not all, that a rate can't be just and reasonable if it's not affordable to a large subset of the population. So when we intervene in a base rate proceeding, we will raise issues. Oftentimes the way that a base rate is proposed, the way they're going to recover those rates is designed in a manner that impacts low-income households in a different way than others. So fixed charge proposals are a good indicator of that. A fixed charge would be, you have a portion of your bill that's billed based on how much you use, and then a portion of your bill that's fixed every month. Well, if that fixed portion goes way up and you're an apartment dweller, which many low-income households are, you're paying a much larger portion just to get in the door before you've even used that first unit of energy. So, you know, fighting back larger fixed charges, which are, you know, there's a trend across the nation to make those kind of flat fees even higher. And that disproportionately impacts a lot of low-income households who tend to have slightly higher usage on a per square foot basis, but lower usage overall because they tend to live in smaller homes. And once you weatherize those smaller homes, they tend to use less energy. So all the more reason to fight those fixed charge proposals. Inclining block rates or declining block rates are much the same. It gets a little technical, but low-income programming. If you don't have a forum where the public utility is regularly reviewing low-income programs, or you don't have a low-income program, a base rate is the perfect opportunity to say, if you're going to raise rates, it's going to be unaffordable, and therefore you need to design or fix or implement a low-income assistance program. And that's where you see a lot of new programs coming online. So in Pennsylvania, we've had a number of water cases recently, Philadelphia Water Company being the most recent, and because of the rates that they had to raise, you know, the intervener in that case won a low-income percentage of income program, which will set low-income rates at a percentage of the household's income not to exceed, I believe, 3%. So that was hugely successful, and certainly looking to other rate proceedings to try and leverage low-income program issues. It can also help you, you know, reconnection fees are often cost prohibitive, so a base rate proceeding is where that would be set. You know, we fought back recently a proposal for a $75 reconnection fee, and I've seen higher ones, but sometimes those can be absolutely prohibitive for a low-income household to be able to reconnect once they've lost service. So yet another issue to raise. Payment arrangement terms, what kinds of payment arrangements they offer, how they disconnect, or what kind of notice proceedings they go through. There's, of course, compliance with whatever your state's regulations are, but there's no reason you can't argue for stronger protections in the tariff rules of various other utilities. And I'll just note that we often, when we enter these cases, the way that we raise them, we will look at census data for the low-income populations within the service territory that utility is serving, and it helps us layer on over top of that kind of self-sufficiency data about how much it costs to be a household in that area. Compare that to what a low-income household's, you know, what level of income they have, and you can then kind of clearly break down just the disparity between what you would need to survive and meet all your basic expenses and what many of the households that we serve are surviving on. There's also deregulation dockets, and if folks on the call are in a state where you can shop for electric or natural gas, this is for you. Or if you're in a state that's considering opening up your utilities to allow for competitive shopping, this is also for you. There are some major problems with the competitive markets here in Pennsylvania and across the nation. For those of us that are experiencing it, we are starting to see, and maybe you've seen this, some in the work that you're doing, but we're seeing some evidence surface that suppliers are reverse redlining and targeting low-income populations, communities of color, non-English speaking customers with really tricky terms and conditions of service, higher rates than what the utilities are actually charging, and it's quite troublesome. But there are a number of different dockets that might be open at any given time in your utility, before your utility commission, that are dealing with some of these issues and reining in suppliers. So there's marketing regulations. Does your state allow door-to-door? We see that Pennsylvania allows it. We see it as a really problematic practice. We've had cases where Spanish-speaking individuals have signed contracts for very high rates for service in a totally English contract. We are seeing folks who live in supportive housing, folks with intellectual disabilities, and who are on a fixed or low income, who are targeted by these marketers who knock on their door and say, would you like to save some money on energy? And lo and behold, they get their next bill and they realize they've been charged 5, 10, 15 times what a utility charges. And we're getting data back in some of the cases that we get involved in, showing that low-income communities in particular are paying not just a couple $100,000, but millions of dollars more than they would if they weren't shopping. So recent case, we've seen $13 million in additional costs to the low-income programs because of unrestricted competitive shopping. Folks just aren't understanding what they're buying, and if you don't understand what you're buying, it's really hard to compare. So I would say this is a huge issue to flag, especially if you know you're in one of those states that folks are selling electricity or natural gas on the competitive market, and taking a look at what some of the rules, what some of the policies and conditions are for how somebody can engage in that competitive market, or how marketers can sell their products. Certainly something to pay attention to. Another big one, of course, is how your utility sets credit collection and billing standards. This is all something that are subject to most states pretty stringent regulations as far as how utility can they charge a security deposit. In Pennsylvania, we fought long and hard to get an exemption for those who are eligible for low-income assistance programs to not have to pay that upfront security deposit. Can act as a huge barrier to set up new service. So looking at what your standards are for that, your payment arrangement standards, how a utility goes about terminating a customer, the kinds of notices they can get, the amount of time they have to respond, whether they have access to reasonable dispute standards, so they could actually, raise an issue if they're being charged unfairly or they think they've been charged unfairly. Of course, medical certificates. The National Consumer Law Center is doing some great work to gather kind of the rules across the country on medical certification to see, just how well utilities are protecting medically vulnerable individuals. We regularly serve clients who have breathing machines and can't survive without electricity, but do your rules protect those consumers well? And of course, winter terminations. Pennsylvania, again, is lucky enough to have a moratorium on winter terminations, but how long does that go and how do they apply that? All of those terms, and you get down into the details, and all of a sudden having a winter moratorium may turn into some, it's not really the protection you thought it was. For instance, if you enter winter without service, there's no requirement that our utilities turn service back on. So sometimes households go multiple years without service and are not really counted in our winter protections or surveys that we conduct. So, again, looking underneath and seeing what the details of those policies are can really help drive protections for low-income consumers. Other issues that are currently kind of hot-button issues, and this is one of the biggest, we hear if you turn on the news any day, you're sure to hear more about solar, more about kind of distributed generation, and the question there, and the proliferation of electric vehicles, right? We all know who Elon Musk is these days, and he certainly can grab the headlines. But who pays for solar? Net metering is a construct that allows solar customers to be paid for the energy that they're producing. But is that really offsetting our costs for an overall system? Well, that's a big question mark. And if you're paying a solar customer full retail rates, then they're no longer paying into the system that's required in order for them to sell their electricity to the utility. Now, if folks are following me, what that means is that the distribution costs that a utility is going to charge their customers gets passed around to a fewer number of customers. And those who are remaining on the system and paying for that system are more and more going to be low-income customers who can't afford to adopt solar and put it on top of their house. So how much do we really pay and subsidize folks who are putting solar on their homes through the net metering structure? And certainly, I, just like many others, are an environmentalist. I believe that we need to do something for to leave a clean future for our children. But we need to examine closely, are low-income customers going to be footing the bill as more and more wealthier residential customers go offline and produce kind of renewable energy on an individual home basis rather than a utility scale. It's a huge issue that impacts our consumers pretty severely. Electric vehicle infrastructure as well. There's a push at many utility commissions across the nation to have ratepayers absorb the cost of developing vehicle charging stations. Now, again, who's going to pay for that and who's going to benefit? My clients often drive, cars from the 90s that use huge amounts of gasoline to power if they have a vehicle at all, and this is something facing rural communities as pretty severely. They need a car to get around, but it's not going to be an electric vehicle. They can't afford that. So if ratepayers are the ones financing electric vehicle infrastructure, how much are low-income communities paying? So I'd encourage you to take a look at that kind of docket. Let's see, any questions so far? I'm not seeing anything come up, but if you do have questions, don't forget to ask. I'm happy to talk through. Some common other proceedings, smart meters. So you've probably seen a push. Many states have already deployed smart meters, meaning meters capable of communicating electronically, usually through a Wi-Fi network, with the utility, so you don't see meter readers walking by anymore. This kind of technology enables a couple things. It enables you to better control your energy usage. It might enable you to use, home energy devices that can help you monitor what you're using more closely. And some of you may be installing this kind of technology at the households that you're serving with weatherization services. But it also enables a couple of dangerous types of things, one being prepay service. Now, prepay service is often billed as something that's going to save consumers energy. It's going to help energy efficiency, but what we're finding is that actually it's a deprivation. It's not really conservation if somebody's forced into it. And what prepay would do is, just like you have to pay your meter at the street when you park your thing, you pump it full of money, and once it runs out, you can get a ticket. Well, once your prepay energy runs out, it flips off, and so you're food gets spoiled, you can't turn on your heat, you can't use your lights. All of a sudden, that becomes an issue. So even more so, while in our current environment, not using prepay or not having prepay service, there are a couple of pilot programs, and Texas is one that uses it pretty significantly. But those in the post-pay, meaning your traditional, you get a bill for service and you pay it, you get a lot of notice, and you have time to kind of balance those monies, rob Peter to pay Paul, and keep your utilities on. But even more in a prepay environment, what you'll start seeing are folks going without their medicine even more than they are now, going without paying rent, facing eviction. We're also seeing it cost a lot more money. So folks who have prepay service, some of those utilities, every time that you load up your card, you have to do so. First of all, you have to have a bank account, and you have to be able to load it electronically, so you need to have access to those kinds of services without disruption, which many people have access to technology, but perhaps only 2 or 3 weeks out of the month before they run out of their prepaid minutes, which is another type of prepay service, of course. But it also is costing more money because there's transaction fees. So some of the work that the National Consumer Law Center has been doing on this is showing that customers are paying making about 7 payments a month on their prepay service. Each time they're getting hit with another $2, $1.75, $2.50, whatever that additional surcharge is for making the payment. So that quickly adds up when you're having to make, you have $20 here, $20 there, and you're trying to keep service on as best you can, but each time you're paying even more just because you have to pay it electronically. Remote termination is another issue that comes up in smart meter proceedings. Once smart meters are deployed, it allows you to not only read the meters remotely, but to turn off service remotely. And just like prepay service is an issue because it can snap off your service without warning, remote termination is also an issue. You no longer have that service provider out at the doorstep kind of assessing, is this a situation where we've got a homebound senior and I'm going to turn them off, and they, are they relying on medical equipment? That additional check where a utility employee goes to the home before service is shut off is a really critical one. And there are ways to get involved in those proceedings and, show that this will hurt communities, and then suggest different ways around that, like additional call center times. So expanding on both both ends, morning and evening, to make sure that that at 5 o'clock, when somebody gets home from work and finds they've been terminated remotely, that they can call into the utility and still reach somebody after hours to get them turned back on if it was in error, so they don't go overnight without service, or perhaps over the weekend. Fee waiver is another thing. Some utilities are putting remote termination in place, but then they're not passing the savings along to the customers that no longer have to pay a meter reader or somebody to go out to the home. So who's paying for that then? Well, in many cases, if nobody's there raising it, if nobody's at the table to say, are you going to reduce your reconnection fee, or are you going to reduce your termination fee, whatever kind of fee structure you have in place, then that will stay in place, and they'll collect just as much money when they did it in person as when they do it remotely. So couple other types of proceedings. There's a lot of mergers and acquisitions happening right now, utilities buying other utilities, public utilities like municipal authorities being bought out, especially in the water context, being bought out by private companies. And in each of those merger and acquisition proceedings typically requires approval by the Commission and typically is an opportunity where you can leverage additional program dollars by saying, look, if you're going to change the structure of how this utility runs, it's going to raise costs, which is going to impact low-income consumers, and you got to do something. Establish a fuel fund, put more money towards weatherization, all kinds of different ways to leverage those proceedings for additional funding. So that was a real brief overview of an awful lot of very large utility issues, just to give you a taste of it and kind of for how, if you're not involved now, how to get involved, or perhaps giving you tips for how to get more involved if you're already kind of doing the work. But what are the next steps? The first thing I would suggest is that you take a look, if you are serving populations right now through weatherization programs or through other programs, that you take a look for what the issues are. Is there a certain program rule that you run into repeatedly that doesn't allow people to access the program that you think could really use the programming? Examine your files for that, and if you don't have a system in place where you can easily do that, maybe talk with the frontline staff in your agency that's doing it and kind of talk through what those issues are. And I'd come up with kind of a list of priority issues. From there, you could start to look into utility dockets, familiarize yourself with the laws and policies, and start to really monitor, looking for opportunities to insert those issues you've identified as priority into these proceedings. Check out the Commission's website. You may have connections with your commissioners that you aren't quite you didn't put together before, but figure out who your commissioners are, look for the hot topics in your state. Usually there's a couple headlines here and there. You could set up a Google alert for, your utility commission so you get news articles. And figure out when the next public meeting is. Sometimes just attending a public meeting can really help you identify where your commissioners are on certain issues and what the opportunities are coming down the pike for intervention. And as I've been saying over and over again throughout, I hope you'll reach out to potential partners. And maybe that's the one thing that I hope you'll leave this webinar with is, knowing that there are a lot of subject matter expertise out there, and you may be able to connect with new partners that can kind of expand your advocacy to cover a broader sphere. Perhaps sharing training. I find that's a really great way for us to kind of open channels of communications with new advocacy organizations to say, hey, we offer this, I could come in and do a half an hour training with your staff, talk about the utility issues, how to connect or how to avoid termination for populations, and that opens a dialogue where you can, then if an issue comes up and you could really use that organization's support, they're more apt to participate and to prioritize utility issues and weatherization issues for some further treatment. So we've got about 8 minutes left, and I built in time for questions. But let me turn it to Natalie and see if there are any questions or.
Nope, we haven't gotten any questions yet, Liz, but while folks are thinking about what they want to ask, I did want to just make a couple of comments and also to say thank you for really laying out the landscape for folks. I think that was really helpful. So the first thing I wanted to say is when you were talking about funding this kind of work, so I did want to make a note, and we've shared information about this before through newsletters and such, but for weatherization organizations, in your state network, when you're working on your state plan, there is an option to set aside some of that money for leveraging work. to fund someone to track these issues and to engage at commission. So if you're going through that process in your state network now, I encourage you to talk to your peer agencies and also your state office and look into that option, and we're happy to help sort of give some background information, and my colleague Meg Power has even sort of collected some language from other states that have done this in the past. So that's one thing I wanted to note. The other piece was that we worked with John Colgan, who was a former utility commissioner in Illinois. Earlier this year, he did a workshop for us, and we also created some materials where he walks through sort of the stages of a rate case and how the proceeding works and all the pieces of it, just so sort of the lay folks can understand how all this comes together. But also really some tips on relationship building with utility commissioners, and I know you talked about that a lot. So I'm happy to share those materials out with folks on the line after this, and it's also available on our website at communityactionpartnership.com. The third piece I'll say, as I'm still waiting for folks to type in their questions, is again on this idea of partnerships. We are hosting our next webinar on July 10th, really around this idea of building partnerships and working in coalitions. That webinar is going to be presented by the Energy Efficiency for All Coalition, who I know PULP works with in Pennsylvania. Their focus is on multifamily energy efficiency, so we thought that would be helpful, and again, just give another opportunity for weatherization organizations to think through working with different types of partners and engaging in different coalitions. So I'll also share that registration information out as the webinar is taking place on July 10th at 2 p.m. with a similar format to this one. The registration is free. And then just lastly, of course, a plug for our National Community Action Partnership Conference. We have an Energy Partnerships track this year taking place August 28th through the 31st in Denver. Really where we're going to be continuing to talk through these kind of issues. Liz was at the one last year, and we're still working on folks for this year, but really just to continue this conversation about how to engage in this kind of work, build those partnerships, engage at utility commissions, and really design and maintain leveraged programs. So with all of that, I didn't know if there was any sort of closing comments that you might want to make, Liz, about this kind of work or getting together with partners before we close out.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the points you just underscored are really important, and now would be the time to get it built into leveraging built into your state plan. So absolutely, you know, it's a pretty stable form of funding. And there's some great resources that you guys have put out over the years on how to do that. And you know, we're happy to the extent you want to reach out directly to me. We're happy to provide, you know, kind of insight on as far as how we do it. But that's, you know, I'd encourage you to just start small and kind of figure out the land, because most likely there are some folks in your state who are already doing it who can be a tutor for you and can kind of, you can leverage each other's resources, so don't be afraid to do that. And starting small, and then, you know, you're not just jumping in head first and then have this huge proceeding that you're not quite sure about. It's easy to kind of wade your toe in there.
Definitely.
But yes, well, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate being able to share some of my thoughts with you all.
Great. Well, thanks so much for all of your insights. Liz's contact information is on the screen, and then also just our website and my email. We're happy to connect you with other folks in your state. Obviously, Liz is a great resource. There are other experts around the country who really want to help you do this work. So I encourage you to get in touch, and just want to say thanks again to Liz, and hope everybody has a great rest of the day. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.